An old man with trembling hands was forced to kneel in the middle of a diner just for daring to look too long at a thug. No one spoke up, no one helped, but no one knew. He was once a commander in Fallujah, the one American soldier called Reaper, the harvester. And when a gun was pressed to the waitress's head, he stood, not to talk, but to end it. This isn't a story about violence. It's about honor and why. You should never underestimate someone just because they're silent. Benny's Diner sat tucked along Highway 287, a 10-minute drive from Decatur. An old-school joint where pancakes always came with strong coffee and folks greeted each other with nods instead of words. That June noon. The air was stifling. The smell of grease mixed with the faint twang of country music from a wall-mounted radio. By the window, an old man sat quietly, hands shaking slightly as he lifted a glass of water, his eyes lost in the void, as if he wasn't there or didn't want anyone to know he was. The door slammed open. The rumble of bike engines still echoed from the lot as 5 bikers strode in. Leather jackets, dark shades, tattoos crawling up their necks. They brought with them the stench of cigarettes and a vibe that tightened the whole room. One kicked a chair. Another let out a barking laugh. The waitress, barely 20, froze mid-pour. The leader scanned the place, smirking. His voice cut through. "This hick joint's got an old man staring people down, huh?" His crew roared with laughter. The old man said nothing, but his eyes, they met the leader's by chance. No fear, no contempt, just the eyes of someone who'd seen things far scarier than 5 shaved heads in a small-town diner. The leader stood, sauntering over, his voice louder than the ceiling fan old man. "You just looked at me, didn't you?" The old man set his glass down. No reply. No retreat. "I'm asking." Staring like that, who do you think you are? An elderly woman at a nearby table quietly got up and slipped out the door. No one stopped her. No one stepped in. The waitress started forward, but another biker blocked her, growling, "Stay put." The old man's hands trembled, not from fear, but from restraint. The veins in his hands bulged, the way they used to when he gripped a trigger in Ramadi's Burning Sands. The thug sneered, his voice sharp. "Kneel. Apologize. Call me Daddy." A wave of filthy laughter erupted. Every eye in the diner dropped to the floor. The old man didn't budge. His hand brushed the knife and fork, which were still lying on his half-eaten plate of pancakes. Wrinkled fingers closed around them. 1 second, then 2. Someone held their breath, but then he set them down, gently, like a man letting go of something too familiar from an old life. The knife didn't clatter, just rested there, like him, silent, but unyielding. The leader leaned in close, his face inches from the old man's. "Didn't hear me? Or are you just too old and senile?" The waitress let out a small sob. A tear hit the floor. And, in an ordinary Texas summer afternoon, amid the soft clink of spoons on porcelain and the faint hum of country music, an old man was forced to kneel, just for looking the wrong way. The whole diner turned away, as if not seeing meant they didn't have to choose. But in that moment, something stirred. Not in the thugs, not in the young girl, but in the old man, the one who once bore a name that made an entire desert tremble. They didn't know what they were about to witness, and they didn't know that long after that day they'd still lower their heads every time they remembered. Before anyone thinks he's just an old man with trembling hands sitting by the diner's window, they should know he once held the lives of 23 men in his grip, on a line between life and death that leather-clad toughs would never dare cross. People didn't notice him. a gaunt old man, white hair neatly trimmed, always wearing a faded baseball cap, driving an ancient GMC Sierra with a license plate too worn to read. Every week, like clockwork. Every Wednesday at 11:45 sharp, he pulled into Benny's, ordered a ham sandwich, no mustard, and a glass of water, nothing more, nothing less. The waitress, Lily, young and eager, tried chatting a few times, but he only offered a faint smile, a nod, never spoke of himself. Once, she asked quietly, "You live alone?" He didn't look at her, just gazed out the window where the wind swept through the oaks behind the diner, and softly said, "Yes, but they're not on this earth anymore." Those words, like a shadow, falling, silent, untouchable. His driver's license, a faded piece of plastic, bore a name John McKenna. But on Marine Corps' radio frequencies, they didn't call him that. They called him Reaper, the Harvester, commander of Alpha Battalion in the fiercest days of Fallujah, 2004. That day, when an entire street was drowned in smoke and gunfire, he led his team through a hail of machine gun fire to save 23 young soldiers trapped in a crumbling building. Only he and Jackson, the radio operator, went back to search for the missing. Jackson took a bullet, collapsing in front of him. In his hand was a broken Marine insignia, wrapped around his backpack strap like an unspoken message. John kept that piece for 2 decades, never letting it go. When the war ended, he didn't return to New York, where his family once lived. Nor did he stay in Virginia with the surviving brothers-in-arms. He drove southwest to the foothills of Guadalupe, where the noise faded, where silence wasn't loneliness, but healing. His wooden cabin had 1 room, a few old books, and a yellowed photo of a boy wearing a backpack backward, hugging a father in uniform. No one knew who he'd been, and he didn't need them to. To him, medals were just metal. Honor was what you carried in your heart, lived with, and never lost, even if no one saw it. Soldiers like him, the ones who came back but never truly returned, often chose to vanish from the world they'd risked everything to protect. And Benny's Diner was one of the few places left that gave him a sliver of peace. Until that noon, when peace was shattered by arrogant laughter, the acrid stench of cigarettes, and the click of a loaded gun aimed at an innocent girl's head. In that moment, to the jeering men, he was just a frail old man with shaky hands and a vacant stare. But they didn't know. Couldn't know. The way he touched the knife and fork wasn't for defense, but to measure distance, grip, trajectory. The way he wiped his mouth with a napkin before standing, not out of politeness, but the habit of a man stepping into battle. It was all still there, coiled inside him, like an old wolf that didn't need to growl to command respect. But when the gun's hammer clicked, when Lily's tears streaked her face, her trembling lips whispering for her mother, Reaper opened his eyes again, this time, not for strategy, not for orders, but for right and wrong, because he didn't come from a place where people stood by. He came from a place where you stepped forward, when no one else dared to do what was right. The fluorescent light quietly spilled over the gleaming Glock in the leader's hand. Not a fake, not a prop for show. A real gun, heavy, cold, and lethal. He pressed it against Lily's temple. The petite waitress stood frozen, hands covering her face. Her voice trembled, breaking, "Please, please don't." The diner sank into silence. Someone had switched off the radio. A few had fled outside. All that remained, the acrid smell of sweat, ragged breaths, and a silence as tight as a noose around the neck. John McKenna sat still, but his shoulders were no longer slumped as before. He placed both hands on the table, easing himself to his feet. The napkin was neatly folded, set beside his plate. Like a ritual. No drama, no rush. Every movement precise, honed from 1,000 repetitions in a life no one had seen. His eyes swept the room, marking targets, gauging distances, cataloging objects, wooden chair, beer bottle, the coffee counter's power cord, metal pipe under the bar, all registered in a single breath. The leader glanced over, smirking. He swung the gun toward him, snarling, "What's this old man thinks he's a hero?" The words barely left his mouth when he stepped, one step, no threat, no warning. But the room seemed to tighten. One of the bikers lunged, aiming to strike. Mistake. Reaper seized his wrist, twisting it back. A sharp crack echoed, like brittle bone snapping in winter. The man howled, but the sound choked in his throat. Before he could react, Reaper kicked a wooden chair into the second man's head. The chair splintered. He crumpled to the floor. The leader's gun veered off target. Reaper grabbed a beer bottle, hurling it with a spin like a grenade. It shattered. Glass shards cut the leader's hand. He screamed, squeezing the trigger. A bullet lodged in the ceiling. Lily collapsed, hands clutching her head, tears streaming amid shouts and breaking glass. Another biker charged from the left. Reaper yanked the coffee machine's cord, looped it around the man's neck, pulled tight, then pivoted, slamming him into the wall. A Texas painting fell, its frame shattered. No one laughed anymore, and no one called him old man. 15 seconds passed. 3 men groaned on the floor. One lay unconscious. Only the leader remained. He stood, but his hand shook. The gun had fallen, his eyes locked on Reaper. He stepped forward, silent. No one in the diner moved. No more crying. Nothing but the sound of his footsteps. He stopped, stood before him. No anger, no pity, only something deeper than hatred, as if he were looking through him, to a young soldier who fell under a hail of bullets, a broken insignia still clutched in his hand. The leader stumbled back, slipping, arms flailing. Reaper bent down and picked up the gun. He checked the cylinder. 1 round fired, 4 left. He studied it for a moment, then tossed it aside, from his pocket. He pulled the broken insignia, glancing at it for just a second. Then he whispered, soft enough for only himself to hear, "Not for me, but for you." And then, without another word, he grabbed the leader's collar, tightened his grip, and slammed him to the floor. His head cracked against the tile. He lay still. No groans, no movement. Only one man stood in the middle of the room, letting out a long breath. Not from exhaustion, but because it was over. For him, war was never something you could bury. It just lay dormant somewhere in the soul, like a beast growling softly in the dark. And when honor was threatened, it woke. Not for medals, not for praise, but because, if he didn't stand, who would? The distant wail of sirens echoed like a scene from an old movie, played in slow motion. 15 minutes after it all ended, the police arrived, but there were no more screams, no more gunshots. Benny's diner slipped back into its usual silence, except for the lingering smell of gunpowder. The glass scattered on the floor, and 5 bikers sprawled out, waking as if from a nightmare. No one was dead, no one was shot, and no weapon was found in the suspect's hands. Just an old man, standing in the middle of the diner, calm, as if what had just happened was what anyone would do when a girl had a gun to her head. A young officer approached, hand resting lightly on his holster. Cautious. "What's your name?" he asked. The man stayed silent for a few seconds. Then he answered, his voice low, not loud. but clear enough for everyone in the diner to hear. John McKenna. The officer jotted it down. But from behind, an older cop, graying hair, face etched like he'd just seen a name from an old battlefield, stepped closer. He stopped, his eyes meeting the man's face. Then he took a step back. Reaper, the word, came out soft, almost caught in his throat. John didn't nod, didn't deny, but his gaze was an answer without words. The older officer raised a hand, all guns lowered. He stepped forward, speaking quietly, just for them. I was logistics in Fallujah. I saw you pull Jackson from the rubble. Then, go back, save 6 more. No one thought you made it out alive. John gave a faint smile, a small one, and he only said, sometimes, I thought so, too. That afternoon, police searched the bikers' warehouse. They found drugs, illegal weapons, and evidence of a federal drug ring, all tied to one name, General Harold Finch, former battlefield commander, once hailed as a hero in the Iraq campaign. The man John had served under, the man he'd saved from an artillery strike in Ramadi, and the man who pinned the first medal on his chest the day Jackson died. John sat quietly in the interrogation room. No excuses, no denials. When a federal agent asked why he hadn't reported, hadn't reached out, hadn't spoken up sooner, he said just one thing, as if it had been held in his heart too long. I stayed silent long enough for the wrong man to be honored. It was time for someone to stand, not for revenge, but to close the book. Those words and the diner's security footage were enough. The feds moved in. But John didn't face the press, didn't take interviews, didn't stand on a podium for praise. He just went back to Guadalupe's hills, back to where honor didn't need witnesses, just living with it. At Benny's, he left one thing behind: a polished steel knife and fork, placed on a clean napkin, with a small note. It's thin but steady handwriting. Keep this clean. For when you need to remember, someone stood. From then on, patrons at Benny's saw a glass frame on the wall holding the knife and fork, the old note, and a silence no one dared break. They didn't tell the whole story. They just said it belonged to a man who stood when no one else dared do what was right. And from that day, no biker ever came near the town again, not out of fear, but because some shadow have real names, and not everyone has the guts to challenge the honor of a man who lived for it. A week later, Benny's diner reopened. The air was cooler, fresh after a night of rain. Fallen leaves blanketed the road out front, and the sun hung gently, as if it had never witnessed the violence that unfolded here. Lily arrived earlier than usual. She stood quietly before the glass frame on the wall, holding a clean cloth, softly wiping away the faint dust that had settled. The knife and fork inside remained untouched. Their steel caught the early light from the window. Beside them, a carefully framed note, its handwriting imperfect but steady, like the man who wrote it had once held firm through war's worst. Keep this clean. For when you need to remember, someone stood. She read each word, and for some reason, her throat tightened. Not from fear, not from trauma, but because she knew something in this place had changed forever. Customers trickled in. The townsfolk didn't ask Lily about what happened, but whenever they sat at the wooden chair in the corner, where John McKenna once sat, they gave a slight nod. As if still greeting someone, though he was no longer there. They still called him the strange old man. But now, no one mocked. They whispered Reaper, afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter the memory. Sometimes, veterans passing through heard the story and just nodded. They knew the name, knew it well. And they knew men like John didn't come around twice, In the weeks that followed, the press hunted for details, but every door was shut. The police refused to talk. The FBI stayed silent, and John McKenna vanished like he'd never existed. A faded GMC Sierra was found at the edge of a national forest. Inside, nothing but a Marine insignia placed neatly on the passenger seat. Next to it, a handwritten letter, unsigned. The ranger read it, then handed it to the police. It held one line: "Honor doesn't need others' approval. It just needs the one who holds it to never let go." The crackdown on the biker gang spread fast. Harold Finch, once a general, once hailed by the media, was arrested in a major federal case. When his name hit the news for interstate drug trafficking, no one mentioned he'd commanded in Fallujah. But in a corner of a military file, the name John Reaper McKenna was noted again, not for praise, but to not be forgotten. There was no ceremony, no brass band, no speeches, no veteran stood beneath a flag to recount heroics. But in a small town, where people still bowed their heads to an empty wooden chair, that name was spoken in silence, like a reminder, a warning, and a lesson everyone needed to learn. Because in the end, what remained wasn't spilled blood or gunfire, not medals, nor TV news, but the memory of a man who stood when everyone else turned away. And so, whenever Lily passed the frame, she'd pause, resting her hand lightly on its wooden edge, not to wipe dust, but to remind herself that some leave only one mark. And that mark was enough to change how a whole town saw honor. And sometimes, just one person standing at the right moment is enough. A month later, an envelope arrived at Benny's diner. No sender's name, just a faint Department of Defense seal. Not an official letter, no note. Just an envelope, as if someone wanted to return a piece of the past to its rightful place. Lily opened it with both hands, carefully, like holding a moment never meant to be touched. Inside was a thin sheet, typed on an old typewriter. No name, no greeting, just a few short lines, evenly spaced, as if the writer had thought long and dared say only this much. McKenna saved 17 men from a kill zone no one else would enter. All survived. 6 became commanders. 3 led strategy. 4 died in Afghanistan. The last one still alive is me. I write this not to thank him, but to apologize, because once I trusted the wrong man, and this time I won't make that mistake again. No signature, just a faint embossed mark at the bottom, an eagle's head in a helmet, with Latin words fortes fortuna adiuvat, fortune favors the brave. Lily read it 3 times. Then I folded the paper. She tucked it into the drawer beneath the glass frame, didn't hang it, didn't tell anyone, because if John were alive, he'd have done the same. Late summer, the town held its annual festival. During the parade, amid flower floats and fluttering flags, an old military jeep rolled slowly through the square. On it, a plain wooden sign, no name, no picture, just one line. For the man who stood when no one else did. The jeep passed. People on both sides stood, no clapping, no cheers, just bowed heads, the silence then heavier than any praise. From that day, Benny's didn't change much, but table 6 by the window stayed empty. Lily left it that way. On it, just a burlap coaster, red thread stitched Reaper, table for a good man. Every morning, she placed a glass of water there. Like he used to drink. If anyone asked, she'd just smile faintly. No explanation, because those who needed to understand already did. Some wondered, no funeral, no news, no gravestone, no one knew when he left, no record marked it. But somewhere, everyone kept a piece of him, in actions, in the quiet change of a town that once turned from justice, in the bowed eyes of those who thought they were tougher than all, and in the memory of a girl who once wept before a gun. John McKenna didn't claim justice for himself. He just stood when honor was at stake, then quietly vanished, as if he never needed to be known, only that someone remembers. There's a line between man and monster, and that line, it's not in strength, not in weapons, but in the moment. You choose to stand for someone when no one sees and you expect no one to care. Autumn came late to Decatur. Leaves turned from green to pale red, then fell along the dirt road to Benny's like fragments of memory drifting slowly. In the first chill of October, Lily arrived at the diner earlier than usual. She set a glass of water on table 6, as she did every morning, but this time she lingered, looked out the window. Early light pierced the thin glass, spilling onto the wooden frame on the wall, where the knife and fork still rested. Silent as a promise, never forgotten. No one asked about him anymore, but something stayed. Not a figure, not a name, just an unseen presence that made people slow their steps as they crossed the threshold. Once, a boy about 10 looked around and asked his mother, "Why doesn't anyone sit at that table?" She paused, then answered softly, "Because someone sat there once, to protect people you've never even met." On quiet afternoons, when the diner held only the ticking of a clock, Lily sat behind the counter, rereading the unsigned letter. Every time, she found no new details, but she understood a little more, not through words, but through feeling. The feeling that what's right doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be done. One Sunday evening, at a small veterans meeting, an older man stood to speak. He wore a worn blazer, his voice rough with age, but when he said Reaper, the room went still. No one interrupted, no one spoke, because they knew it wasn't just a nickname. It was a symbol of those who don't need permission to do what's right. Those who choose to stand, even if it makes them misunderstood, are cast out, and sometimes vanish from this world like old ink unread, but forever stained into the page, a year after it all happened. Behind Benny's, under the shade of an old oak, a stone bench was placed by the trunk. No nameplate, no carvings, just a small inscription. He never asked to be remembered, but we remember him anyway. Each time Lily passed, she'd pause, lightly touching the cold stone. No tears, no sadness, just peace. The kind of peace that only comes from someone who lived true to what the world forgot. Honor, and in an age of noise, sometimes, the loudest echo is the silence of a man who stood, not to be known, but because he couldn't turn away. They come like the wind, leave like smoke, but every time we bow our heads to something right, they're there, not in name, not in sound, but in how they make us remember what it means to be human. If this story made you pause for a moment to think, if you believe there are still people like John McKenna, quiet, steadfast, needing no praise but never abandoning what's right, then share this video, not to tell his story, but to keep alive something fading in today's world, silent courage. Subscribe to the channel to not miss other stories, where kindness, honor, and sacrifice are always remembered with the respect they deserve. And if you have something to say, leave a comment. We're listening. Like someone once quietly stood just to protect what was right.